So this is a gauge swatch. And when you're told to do a gauge swatch, make it bigger than you're going to measure because the edges will always squash in. So I've done my gauge swatch. This is quite a big piece of knitting. You don't have to do so much. And I've just gently pinned it down. So not stretched, just patted it flat and pinned it down. So why do we do gauge swatches? Gauge swatches are incredibly important if you're knitting a garment that you want to fit or want to look good on you for a number of reasons. First of all, you want it to fit you very well. You've put all of this great work into, you've probably bought expensive, beautiful yarn. So you want to make sure by the time you're finished that you're going to be proud to wear it. That's the first and most obvious reason. Secondly, if you've used a substitute yarn instead of the yarn that's recommended by the pattern, you want to make sure that the quality of the fabric is going to be similar so that it falls or drapes on you in a similar manner that was meant by the designer of the pattern. So by doing a gauge, you can feel, yes, is it tense? Is it stiff enough? Or is it loose enough? And you can make sure that that is going to work for you. Also, over time, your knitting is going to change and you might differ. You might be a little tighter or a little looser. And that makes a big difference, not so much on chunky wool, but particularly on fine wool. It's amazing how much just even changing up 1/4 of a millimetre on a needle will change the complete feel of the garment on you. I've done that many times. I've changed from, say, a 3.5 millimetre needle to a 3.75 millimetre, and it's made all the difference on making the fitted garment just look lovely instead of to be slightly too tight or slightly too loose. So when we have our gauge, like this one in front, most patterns will tell you to either do a 4x4 inch gauge. That means you want to find out how many stitches you've got across a row in 4 inches, or how many rows you've got in 4 inches. Now I work in centimetres, not inches, but that is 10 centimetres by 10 centimetres. Now, occasionally a pattern will say, how many stitches do you have, or tell you that you're meant to have X amount of stitches in 1 inch. Now, 1 inch is 2.5 centimetres. That's really not a good enough gauge. It's not going to give you an accurate measurement. Because, for instance, if we were to measure, as an example, we measure from here to 2.5 centimetres, which is that's 1 inch, and we might find that it's 1, 2, 3, maybe 1/4. So three stitches and 1/4. So there's a little bit of fudge here. And if you were to multiply that fudge just to even in the space of 10 centimetres, let alone the complete width of your torso, you'll find that you've got a lot more room for error than if you were to take the measurement over 10 centimetres and you've only got one little bit of fudge, and that fudge will be multiplied over every 10 centimetres. So it's much better to do a bigger gauge. So I'm going to show you now. We're going to do 10 centimetres or 4 inches, however you like to work. So we've got these lines of columns, and each column is like a V, like this, like my finger. And that shows one stitch, and it goes right up to its stitch up here. So we're going to put our tape measure and put a pin right before, say, the first stitch that we're going to measure. And you have to excuse my old and well-loved tape measure. I've had it for a long time, done many gauges. And then I'm going to find the 10 centimetres or 4 inches, and I'm going to put my needle in there. And then I can count. But before I do that, I'm also going to do the same in this direction. So I find a V, so that shows the top of a stitch, So I put the end of my tape measure there, and I'm going to put a pin in there. And I'm going to travel right down this column. There's my 10 centimetre mark, and I'll stick a pin in there. So now I can take my my tape measure away, and I can start counting. So we've got the V's like this. So that would be the first stitch. That's stitch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So my gauge is 13 stitches to 10 centimetres, and now we'll count the rows. So here's the top of the stitch here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So 17 and a half. So my gauge would be 17 and a half rows to 4 inches or 10 centimetres. And I think I said 13 stitches across for 10 centimetres. So that's how you measure a gauge. If after measuring your gauge you find you have more or less stitches than what the pattern says you should have for the gauge, you need to go up or down a needle size. For example, if your pattern calls for a gauge that has 12 stitches per 10 centimetres or 4 inches and you have 13 stitches, you need to go up a needle size. So start by going up a half a needle size first. For example, if you were using a 5mm needle, you would go to a 5.5mm. If you have fewer stitches than required, you need to go down a needle size. And the stitch count, so how many stitches you have in your row, is actually more important than your row count. And this is because the stitch count is going to determine how wide your garment will be, and that's very important for a good fit. Your row count can be flexible because often a pattern will say knit until the work measures a particular length. For example, knit until the sleeve measures 16 centimetres. So it doesn't matter how many rows it takes you to achieve that 16 centimetres, your work is going to be, or garment is going to turn out to be the correct fit. So I really hope you're inspired to put the effort in to make a gauge so that you have beautifully fitted garments, and the work that you go into your knitting doesn't end up being a garment that's at the back of your closet with an ill fit.